Welcome, everyone, to the Strongest Steel podcast, episode 18. Just want to welcome everyone and acknowledge that I am here on the traditional unceded territories of Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we have a great episode. Well, maybe not great, but an exciting episode for everybody today, talking about trade and tariffs and all things like that, which I guess isn't exciting for us as workers in Canada, but it's something that's topical, and we have a couple of great guests joining us today. So we'll just get right into it. And I just thank you, Guio and Bea, for joining us. So I have Guio, who's a researcher and our tariff expert at the Canadian National Office, and Bea Bruske, who's the president of the Canadian Labour Congress, who's been very active on the tariff file. So I'll just start by I guess I should say I'm Scott Lunny. I'm the director of District 3. I use pronouns he and him, and I'm the host of the Strongest Steel podcast. And then I'll ask Guio to introduce himself, and then we'll go to you, Bea.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. Yeah, I'm Guio Jacinto. I'm the economic and trade policy analyst researcher with the USW National Office here in Toronto. Prior to that, I came out of one of our locals in Southern Ontario, local 14162, which was Bull Moose Tube, a small hollow structural sectional steel producer. So yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
Well, thanks for joining us. Yeah, go ahead, Bea.
And I'm Bea Bruske. I'm the president of the Canadian Labour Congress, and I'm coming to you from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba, home of the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, the Oji-Cree, the Dene and Dakota people, and homeland of the Métis Nation. And thank you for the invite, Scott.
Oh, thank you for being here. So we'll just jump right into it. I mean, there is something like, I think I have this right, $1.3 trillion annually of trade between Canada and the United States. And right now we have threats of tariffs and some duties and investigations and all sorts of things that have been threatened, tweeted by President Trump. I guess I'll just start by saying, what's your general sense of this, and how is it different from, previous trade challenges we've had in Canada? Maybe Bea, you can start.
Sure. So the challenge here is that every single day there's a new announcement, there's a move forward and a move backward. And so the uncertainty of Trump's threats of trade are having a significant impact on jobs and on our economy already. 2.4 million jobs in Canada are directly reliant on U.S. exports. And so any time that you threaten trade tariffs, they're going to have an impact on those employers, and that's going to have an impact on jobs and communities. So the uncertainty has been really, really challenging over the last 6 weeks already. People are very worried. People are concerned about what the future holds for them. And we're very, very focused on making sure that our government's response is a strong response. And we've seen that in terms of some of the retaliatory tariffs that have been announced. And we need to continue to hold the line in terms of being strong in our response, because we need the U.S. to understand that as they're trying to give tax breaks to billionaires, it's going to impact workers not just on the Canadian side of the border, but on the U.S. side as well. So we need to exert pressure wherever we can so that there's some sanity in this trade tariff situation.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned tax breaks. I just, like, off the top, I think that's one of the craziest things I think I've heard any politician say, is that, we're going to do some retaliatory tariffs and collect the money, and then Poilievre and a couple others said, and then we'll give tax breaks to everybody, like, instead of returning the money to the folks that are impacted. But anyway, Guio, over to you.
Yeah, no, I think he's right. I think it's also unprecedented on a number of regards. Right? I mean, we haven't faced this type of general tariff threat from the United States in a very long time, especially on not as extensive as this is, right? So it's definitely a much tougher threat than we faced in 2018, 2019, which was, primarily around steel. But even on that front, this time there's a potential stacking of steel tariffs. So we haven't faced that in a long time. I think the more crucial thing here is that this is a significant assault, and I don't know how to describe it in any other way, it's a significant assault on the economic, sort of the export model that Canadian economy has sort of built itself on in the last, say, 40, 50 years, and it's only been accelerated with the further integration of NAFTA and the free trade agreement. So a lot of our sectors, our manufacturing sector, is really dependent on exports to the United States, and we're kind of feeling the pain, or at least the little leverage that we have now in a trade war with the United States. So it's definitely a challenge and a very significant one to the manufacturing sector in particular.
Yeah, you talked about the stacking of tariffs, and I think lumber's a good example of that. I mean, there's already countervailing duties, anti-dumping duties on lumber producers. I know here in BC, 75% of softwood lumber produced in the province is exported to the U.S. But the stacking is that the 25% blanket would be on top of that, and then there's also discussion of an additional. Like Trump kind of asked the Department of Commerce, I think, to do an additional Section 232 investigation, which by my understanding is into like national defense, and that would be, or defense of the nation or whatever, and that would be on top of all those other ones. So you're talking like 60 something per, it's a lot of math, but 60 something % potentially by the end of the year on lumber, or even more, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And we haven't faced that level of tariff threat in a long time, if ever. So, it's definitely some challenging times. I don't know how to describe it in any other way than a significant existential threat to the manufacturing sector and to our economic sovereignty.
Yeah, for sure. And so we know, in District 3, we know some of the stuff that is impacted that we produce, right? Lumber, obviously, but, potash, uranium, other critical minerals, but and not necessarily steelworker members, but certainly oil. But it's an impact on, like even bigger impact, I think, on some of the provinces in the east, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada. I don't know, Bea, you talk to folks all across the country.
For sure. So we always hear about the automotive industry, and of course that is a pretty significant industry in the Ontario sector for sure. 125,000 Canadians work in the automobile industry. Of those, it's assembly, it's part production, it's everything in between. And the indirect jobs that the automotive industry creates, especially in Ontario, is about 462,000 jobs that are indirectly impacted by the auto industry. So it's really, really huge. But I would also turn our attention to aerospace. Aerospace is another big sector, right, out of Quebec that's going to have significant job impacts. Aerospace, just like auto, those parts and those planes go back and forth multiple times before you end up with a finished product. So many, many workers in those industries. In our agriculture industry, 1 in 9 Canadian jobs depend on agriculture, and a lot of 57% of Canadian exports go to the U.S. as well. So when you think about, that pork chop that you buy at the grocery store on the weekend, that piglet is born in one country, raised in another, goes back and forth multiple times as well before you have that final product in your meat department in your grocery store. So beef, pork, poultry, fish, grains, of course, all those kinds of things. Canada is actually also the top exporter of confectionaries, which I did not know until about a week ago, that 36% of U.S. imports on, chocolates and sweets comes directly from us, which was, not something that's widely known. Our pharmaceutical industry, 64% of pharmaceutical manufacturing goes to the U.S. from Canada. So that's another 34,000 jobs in Canada that are reliant on that. And then, of course, we also have the big one that we hear about all the time, which is semiconductors or chips, which is so necessary for automotive, for telecoms, for defense, for a variety of different low carbon technologies that both countries use. There's 124,000 Canadian jobs connected to that. So the impacts are very real. And our economists at the CLC have predicted that if these wide-ranging tariffs are in fact implemented, that we could see in the first 12 months alone 1.5 million Canadian job losses, which is unbelievable outside of a wartime kind of scenario. It is really a dire and an unprecedented situation that we need to be responsive to.
For sure, yeah. No, and I know our folks are obviously very concerned and scared about their own livelihoods, but certainly the impact more broadly on the whole Canadian economy is huge. Guio, steel and aluminum, that's another one that's going to have potentially stacking tariffs. I know you do a lot of work on that sector. What's the impact of the tariffs look like on steel and aluminum?
Yeah, no, not very good. We have, between the two sectors, we have about 30,000 members in steel and aluminum. And one of the differences with this round of steel tariffs and tariffs in general is obviously, as we've mentioned, they would stack, but the steel and aluminum executive order also targets derivative steel and aluminum products, so downstream steel products that have and aluminum products that contain steel with them, and the intention is to tariff the steel and aluminum content of those derivative goods. So that's a further pressure, right? Further downstream pressure to, that steel pulls a lot of demand. Some of these steel consuming industries, that those would be targeted, and that would also affect steel and aluminum demand, or Canadian steel and aluminum demand, sort of indirectly through some of the products that are used to produce them. So, it's a massive threat. Canadian steel production, we export about half of our domestic production to the United States, over half. It's about 55%. And so a lot of, Canadian steel production is our industry is dependent on the export market, the U.S. export market. So with stacking of tariffs, potentially 50% plus whatever existing anti-dumping and countervailing duties that we have against us. I think there's a few cases where the U.S. has those duties on us. Like I said before at the onset, this is a significant threat to the model, particularly in the steel industry, the export dependent model that we've built up in the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. The things we learned, like derivatives is like other products, downstream products. And then I learned that additive means stacking. The tariffs are going to be additive. That means they're going to stack on top of each other. The things we learn when there's a bit of a trade dispute. I want to shift a bit to responses and just get your take on both of your takes on how the governments have responded so far, and then maybe what they could be doing. I know we have varying degrees of engagement across the country as unions and as labor folks. I know there's some engagement nationally. Certainly in Western Canada, we have I'm sitting on a task force with the provincial government around trade and economic security, and there's a fairly well thought out response in BC that's coming from the government, but with advice from industry, from First Nations, from union leaders, and of course from the various departments in the government. Manitoba, likewise, we have a seat at the table with Premier Canoe, and I know Bea, you're part of that as well. But what do we think? And I think Manitoba's taken a good response. I don't know, Alberta, Saskatchewan, a little less Team Canada, I would say, out of those two provinces. And I know Guio in Ontario, the premier there seems to be captain Team Canada. So anyway, just wanted to know what your two thoughts are on the responses so far.
Well, certainly what a difference it makes to have a provincial NDP government, as you've pointed out, Scott, because both in BC and Manitoba, Labour has strong seats at the table to have discussions with, employers as well as nonprofits and First Nations groups in terms of what the response needs to be. And so I very much appreciate that aspect of it. I think that we've seen the provinces pull together very strongly to say that we need to be strong in the face of these tariff threats, a little less so in Alberta. But we also have a significant challenge with our federal government right now. We're going to have a new prime minister this week and probably a federal election 5 minutes from that time. So that also creates a bit of a challenge in terms of having a strong and focused response. I am happy that they've announced counter tariffs because I do think we need to signal that we are serious in terms of our approach and that we can't be bullied. But I'm extremely frustrated by the lack of action from our federal government in terms of worker supports. And I can unpack that a little bit later in terms of what our demand has been. But to date, on Friday, the only thing that we've heard so far is, the federal Minister of Employment, Minister McKinnon, talking about work sharing. Well, work sharing is great if you've got a job to share, but if you don't have a job to share, then you still have no job and you have no additional enhanced supports that workers and communities are going to need. For sure, yeah. Guio?
Yeah. I mean, to pick up where Bea sort of dropped it off, looking at the federal response on Friday, I think, half of me thinks this is, because of the period of interregnum and in between prime ministers, there's a little bit of uncertainty there. And so maybe the maneuvers that the federal government can make aren't the conditions aren't there yet. But, this first sort of response is leaves a little bit to be desired. I mean, I think there's $6.5 billion announced in those responses. $5 billion is meant to support industry-find export markets. There's $500,000 there of credit extensions, and then another $1 billion, I think, to the agriculture sector in loans as well, right? So these are all measures, apart from the $5 billion. I mean, these are all measures that increase the balance sheets or the liabilities of companies, where I think we should be focusing on the revenue and the asset side, right? And so, and on the workers' support side, I mean, there were some extensions or expansions to the work sharing program. But my sense is that I feel like this first rollout is really underestimating the potential threat that these tariffs may cause to the manufacturing sector. I think we should be thinking about it in terms of a potential existential threat to employment and to capacity, which, again, just strikes at the heart of our economic sovereignty as a nation. And so our positions have been, as Bea said, we share the same position. Like we've argued for retaliatory tariffs. They need to be product for product and then dollar for dollar as well, as far as we can get through a dollar to dollar path, given the trade surplus that we have. But the second sort of overarching framework that we look at or vector is we need producers to keep on producing, and we need workers to keep on working. And so some of the measures that we've been pushing, we should have buy Canadian procurement policies. This is the time for those commitments to be made. We also need to, incentivize the private sector to use Canadian-made goods. We floated the idea of a made in Canada tax credit. We think that potentially might be one avenue. But also, now's the time also for nation-building projects, right? This is the time to think big and think how we can, build infrastructure projects that serve a real social purpose, but also bring the country together and the Canadians together, versus this tariff threat. So. Those have been some of the things that we've been pushing. On the employment support side, again, like I said, I think the work share developments are positive, but it's as if the federal government's viewing this through a cyclical shock to industry, where, as I said before, we view this as a potential structural shock, right? And so we're going to need some unorthodox policy interventions, potentially similar to the ones that we saw during COVID. A wage subsidy scheme to have workers remain linked to their employers, but also potentially other ones. Like one of the other ones that we've been pushing too as well, which we started talking about at the end of 2024 in the context of economic security in a submission to Global Affairs Canada, is the creation of buffer stocks or strategic reserves. Right, the U.S. has a strategic petroleum reserve where they buy up oil and warehouse it and stockpile it. They have a critical minerals reserve, right? We will probably need something similar in the immediate term as using the powers of the government as the purchaser of last resort to create critical mineral stockpile, right? To ensure that producers keep on producing and workers keep on working. But we should also think about some of these strategic reserves as long-term policy programs, as programs that we have as a country. I think we're one of the few countries that don't have sort of expanded stockpile programs. Other than I think the one that we have now is for medical equipment and other similar things. So, anyways, those are some of the things that we've been pushing.
Yeah, that's right. And I like that producers keep on producing and workers keep on working, and I think that's critical because something you mentioned is the loss of capacity. And I know a lot of our employers, to their credit, are not talking about layoffs quite yet. Hoping it's a short-term, kind of glitch with threats, and if there are tariffs that they're not on for a long time, and they don't want to lose workers and all that kind of stuff. But that's not a forever thing. That's a short-term, immediate thing. And once we start losing workers out of plants, they do close and they don't come back. We know that very well in the steelworkers. Once something closes, it doesn't come back. So, a real urgent focus on exactly what you said, I think is right. Workers keep on working, and producers keep on producing is the best best bet for us. I know we've I think that the Made in Canada tax credit and even a Made in each province tax credit would be a huge step to incent private sector procurement. We see a lot of the governments talking about public sector procurement, but private sector procurement would be huge to move that domestic and be talking about buying from within your province and within your country. I mean, a lot of this is the non-tariff type things are what we've been in the labor movement advocating for years, like an industrial policy for the country and for our province. I know, Bea, you've been talking about other non-tariff kind of things, or some of the same things Guio talked about. What's the CLC saying, and what do you hear other unions saying about non-tariff things that we can do to respond to this?
Well, one of the things that frustrates me is that we hear from provincial and federal leaders about the interprovincial trade imbalance and, the interprovincial trade barriers and those kinds of things. The reality is, even if we strike down every single regulation that's out there, and let's remember regulations are to protect workers, it's health and safety, it's, making sure that vehicles meet certain standards. Like, there are reasons why we have these interprovincial regulations that we need to be adhering to. We shouldn't just be throwing them out. We should be studying them to see what is possible and what is not possible, what needs to be hung on to. But even if we streamlined all of that, that does not make up for the reality check on the impact on the economy that these U.S. tariffs are going to have. So I wish we would stop talking about interprovincial stuff and start talking about the big things that Guio also spoke about investing in infrastructure, investing in manufacturing across Canada, investing in housing. We so badly need non-market housing. This is the time to actually invest in that kind of housing, to keep lumber mills going, to keep the steel manufacturing going, right? We need to invest in energy and in green jobs. We need to invest in public services and in our care economy. Now is the time to actually bulk up investments in those areas to make sure that we can retain those jobs and to build those jobs and make sure that our communities can stay strong and healthy. Workers are really worried. They're already being impacted, not just in the direct impact jobs, but in communities that are very specifically industry dependent. I was in Sault Ste. Marie last month with a number of your coworkers, Scott, and some of the members there were telling me they're already worried about potentially having to sell their homes, and that's before an impact is even felt. That has impacts not just on that particular workplace, on that particular job, that has impacts on the entire community. So we need to see our governments really stepping up at this time with generation building kind of projects and to get those things off the ground. We need to see magnificent changes to our employment insurance system. Only 2 in 5 workers currently qualify when they are actually out of a job when they apply. So we need to really make sure that more workers qualify, that it's for a longer period of time, and that it's not just a maximum $695 a week that you can get, because I'm not sure about you folks, but the members that I talk to, that does not replace the income that they have. That's not going to make sure that they can still pay the rent and put groceries on the table. We need to have some protections for borrowers so that banks can't just foreclose on houses if people are, for a period of time without income. We need to make sure that we really diversify our economy and also invest in that east, west, north infrastructure, right? And support roads, rails, ports, all those kinds of things. So we have a lot on the to-do list, and talking about interprovincial stuff does not address any of those things. So I'm very frustrated about that, and we keep talking to politicians of all stripes at every level about thinking big, because this moment requires us to think big.
Yeah, no, I think that's you read my mind. I was going to ask about the interprovincial stuff. So, and because I know we hear about alcohol and wine, and sort of seems like low hanging fruit, but it's not really a huge amount of upside to all of that. And you're right. There's many of those regulations that folks are talking about are put in for some reason, and we need to be looking at that and making sure it makes sense actually to standardize things across the country and that we're standardizing up if we're doing that. But really, that's not doesn't address the magnitude of the potential threat to the economy.
And as you said earlier, any money that we take in from counter tariffs needs to go to support workers first and foremost, to support those communities first and foremost, and then to actually invest in these infrastructure investments that we need to see to actually maintain good jobs and to build a new economy that we need that's less U.S. dependent.
Yeah, for sure. And so we're advocating for all these things at the government level and obviously talking to whoever will listen, but ultimately, is there anything else that we should be doing? And I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sort of asking it out there. I think about it every day. We're talking to governments. We're talking about the things that we want to see. Is there something that our members should be doing and our locals should be doing? Like, what do we need to do to make sure that the threat of this is really addressed and that workers are looked after?
I think the first thing that we can do is what I think most of us are already doing, which is to buy local, to buy union, most importantly, right? And to demand of our elected politicians that procurement policies, whether it's municipal, provincial or federal, actually utilize things made in Canada, right? Goods and services manufactured here in Canada. So first and foremost, that's something that all of us can do, and we should be doing that consistently anyways. We've always been talking about this, but even more so now. But we shouldn't be shy to phone up our local politicians, right? Whether it's municipal or provincial or federal, to say, hey, there's a federal election coming up right now. What is your party's position on, these 8 things that we need, whether it's employment insurance reform, whether it's, building out our capacity in terms of roads and infrastructure and ports and those kinds of things. Like, let's not be shy about demanding better, especially in the light of an upcoming federal election. And let's make sure that we're actively participating with our provincial governments as well to demand the same.
Yeah, I think a few things, a general one and a particular one. I think at the sort of broad level, I think one of the things that has been concerning me in the last little while is that you have 2 political leaders, Mark Carney, who's mentioned he wants to balance the budget. You've had Pierre Poilievre, who in front of Parliament or the House of Commons a couple of days ago said we should be worried about government deficits driving inflation, all in the context of a potential recession, right? Where we're going to get a bad deficit. We're going to get a deficit anyway. It's going to be a bad one because it's going to be driven by the decline in economic activity and the decline in tax revenue, right? And so I think one of the things that we really need to push back on, particularly at this moment, is that we're going to go into debt, but we need to go into debt to finance things that are going to create wealth in the long run. So we need to get rid of this balanced budget discussion because we need deficit spending. We're going to need it. There's no way of getting around that. So I think that's at the general level, right? We need to increase aggregate demand for Canadian-made products, and I think Bea's point of buying Canadian, I think that's absolutely crucial at all levels, from the micro level, the individual level, to government institution to private firms. I think more at the micro or the industry level, and I'm looking at it more from the steel industry perspective. I know this general discussion of tariffs, sometimes a lot of folks in the public sphere tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater when we talk about tariffs, right? Like, obviously tariffs against Canada are a bad thing. They don't make very much economic sense, but they are crucial parts of or a crucial component or tool in the industrial policy toolbox, right? And so, for example, in the Canadian steel sector, we would probably benefit from a more robust usage of a tariff regime, right, against countries that are serial subsidizers and dumpers of their products in the Canadian market. And so, one of the other things that we've also been advocating for is increased use of, or an expanded use of Canada's Section 53 of the customs tariff, to particularly target countries that contribute to overcapacity. And of course, everybody knows China is the main culprit here, but it's not just China, right? And it's not just direct exports from China. It's a whole other host of practices and countries that engage in global overcapacity. And so, I guess my main point here is, what tariffs are bad, and tariffs against Canada on part of the United States is a bad thing, but we can't throw tariffs out as legitimate industrial policy tools as well that we probably should be looking at increasing their usage.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Not all tariffs bad. Tariffs for dealing with unfair trade and unfair trade practices and the like are a legitimate tool, and it's a legitimate tool that Canada has used and the United States has used in the past. But that's not the same thing as what President Trump is doing right now, which is just sort of willy-nilly threatening tariffs for. We're actually not quite sure what the motive is, unless you really believe, which I keep hoping is not true, that it's to put so much pressure on us that he can annex Canada to become the 51st state. Like I really hope that's not true, but more and more it's seeming like that. I just wanted to go back to something, Bea. I think you're right on to talk about demanding. I mean, that's what we need to do, is we need to be demanding the appropriate response to this as workers and as unions. We can't let folks just sort of talk around the issue and do, what I think is what has been done so far on the kind of worker and industry support side, is just like play around the edges. This is truly a potentially sort of, structural change. I think you said, Guio, before, it's going to be a structural change to our economy, and we need to make sure that we don't lose industry, we don't lose workers, we don't lose capacity to have an economy, if and when the U.S. sort of troubles are gone. Trouble, I guess. Trouble. It's a singular trouble, maybe. But anyway, we're coming near the end, so I not drastically near the end. So just wanted to know if you had any stuff that we haven't covered on this issue, or anything else that you wanted to leave us with. Maybe Guio first.
No, I don't have too much to add. I think we've covered quite a bit today already, particularly on the policy response. I think that's where the focus is right now. We need to, make sure that government is listening to us, and that we're pushing a consistent and clear theme and message. And that, so far we've seen the first steps of the government's response, and, probably a little bit inadequate is an understatement, but we need to keep on pushing to make sure that, the integrity of our industrial economy remains intact, and that, not just that, but we need to build it out and build more economic resiliency, because unfortunately, as it looks now, the United States is not looking as the most reliant trade partner, let alone ally. So anything that we can do on the industrial policy front to build domestic economic resilience while diversifying our trade relationships, I think we need to be on the same team and pushing that and with common policy proposals all across the board.
Yeah, for sure. And it's the strongest steel podcast in District 3. You can swear. You could say that the response so far has been shit. It's okay.
Thanks, Scott.
less than adequate, I guess, is fine. But I did just want to say, while I have the chance, to just say really thank you, Guio, for what you do. I mean, folks may or may not know that all of us in the districts and the staff reps and I'm from myself for sure, I'm sure Marty and Kevon and Dominic really rely heavily on the work that you do on this file, on lots of stuff that you do, but particularly on this file. I mean, we get stuff seems like daily from you and the national office and also from the CLC on the file, and it's immeasurably helpful. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate all the work you've been doing on this.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Scott.
And Bea, any last comments or things? I'm sure there's lots of stuff that you want to say that we haven't covered, but
I would leave your listeners with this. It's a call to action. If you're obviously already involved in your union, you're listening to this podcast, but it's time to step it up a notch and to become more involved. There's too much at stake to be sitting back at this moment in time to just let the news wash over us. We need to be active participants in what happens next. And that does mean at the upcoming opportunities that you'll have through the federal election to grill those people knocking on your doors. It also means, actively supporting the candidates that are going to stand up for Canadian workers and doing that work. And it really just means, a call to action to just become more engaged with your members in every single workplace so that they know what's at stake and so that they also have the pathway in terms of working towards a good conclusion for all of us. And lastly, I would invite your listeners to participate in the CLC campaign, workerstogether.ca. Workerstogether.ca. Just sign up for that. We'll give you all kinds of information. And, if you're participating in a labor event and a union event and you don't know the answer and you're shy to put your hand up, you know what? Ask that question anyways, because I guarantee you there's at least a handful of others who don't know the answer to that and who really want to have that question asked. So step outside your comfort zone, get more engaged, and let's do this.
That's awesome. Thanks. And I'm glad you said the workerstogether.ca because I'm going to say at USW.ca, there's lots of stuff around tariffs and trade and what we're doing to push back as the steelworkers at USW.ca, and then at workerstogether.ca, there's some stuff from the CLC, obviously on the same thing. So there's lots of information out there. If folks who are listening have questions, as always, you can email d3comms@usw.ca. So D, the number 3, and then comms@usw.ca if you have questions or comments or feedback, and continue to follow us on social media at USW District 3 for all the things that we're doing in the district and at the national office. I just again want to thank both of you for being on the podcast, the Strong as Steel podcast. Obviously, as folks could tell from listening, you both are very working really hard on this file and have lots of great ideas about what we can and should be demanding from our governments in terms of response. And it is a significant threat. I think I saw 100,000+ steelworkers members in Canada could be potentially directly impacted by tariffs, certainly in steel, aluminum, lumber, industries like that. The impact could be devastating, and we need to be on top of that. We need to make sure that our governments provincially and federally are doing everything they can to end the threat and the tariffs as quickly as possible from the U.S., but at the same time continuing regardless to do those other things that we were talking about, the non-tariff things, investing in domestic industry, investing in infrastructure and all the things that we can and should be doing to make sure that we have a strong economy moving forward with or without free access to the U.S. market. So again, thank you so much, Guio. Thank you so much, Bea, for joining us. It's been the Strongest Steel podcast, episode 18. And please keep listening. Tell your friends. We got to get up there on the podcast charts. We're inching our way up there. So stay listening. And thanks again for joining us on the Strongest Steel podcast.